so to cap off my series on top 3 variations for each lift, our final one's going to be deadlift. So much like I said in my bench press video, if you watch that one, when it comes to why we program variations in general, not for each specific lift, but for all lifts in totality, kind of what is the benefit of a variation versus just the comp specific lift. In video 1, when I cover the squat, I give a much more detailed breakdown of that in the intro. But when we kind of look at the general reasons, I'll kind of give a recap of that now. So to summarize, variations of a lift allow us to accomplish 4 possible things. 1 is the self-limit in exercise, being able to use a lower absolute load due to the variation being a little bit harder than the actual competition-specific movement. 2, it can help to correct movement faults. That's something we'll talk about throughout this video, of kind of the things that these variations on deadlift can kind of do to help correct your actual deadlift when we transfer those back. It can help with fatigue management, and that kind of goes back to the self-limiting aspect of kind of using variations to kind of manage fatigue within a weekly structure or a block structure. And lastly, a variation could possibly have a direct transfer of strength to the competition lift. Some people very much will have a possible 1-to-1 ratio where if they increase their strength on the variation, they see a very direct transfer of strength and improvement to their competition lift. I'd say that's probably more on the rarer side, but the first 3 are probably the primary, and definitely direct transfer of strength is a possibility and something we can use variations to accomplish. So moving into my top 3 deadlift variations. So just like bench press and squat, I'm gonna really break down of kind of why I like them and what's the benefit from them. I'm gonna really get into how to do them, and as we get forward, you're gonna see one of these movements I really break down how to do them, as I think it's very important to understand how this movement's performed. I'm gonna explain who should be programming these and kind of like the things they can fix, who shouldn't program these and who they're really not for, and then lastly, kind of how we can implement these and program them within our training. Within that, I'm gonna go through the order of them, and unlike the other 2 videos where it was very much like the first one was the most applicable and I kind of dropped down from there, I would kind of say the first 2 here are kind of 1A and 1B. And to allude to what my top 3 deadlift variations are, they're gonna be pause deadlifts, RDLs, and then tempo eccentric to soft touch deadlifts. And the 1A and 1B is pause deadlifts and RDLs. I think both of those are vitally important, and I was struggling to choose which one was probably the primary one, but when we get to RDLs in particular, that's the one I'm talking about in the sense that we're really gonna break down of how to do it correctly. I've been kind of thinking about doing an RDL specific video because I think that's something of just understanding how to hinge is something a lot of people struggle with, and if you've watched my other deadlift videos, that's something I really hammer in. And so I'm gonna use this video to really dive into how to hip hinge and how to RDL, and so hopefully that can kind of accomplish kind of what I was wanting to put out there in regards to making sure people understand how to hinge properly. As I go through these, I'm not gonna break down deadlift specific technique, more so the movements that I'm talking about. So if you're wanting more deadlift specific technique, I have 2 other videos, one about optimizing your starting position for lockout and the other one about slack pull, so I'll link those below. So if you're wanting more deadlift specific technique, make sure to check those out after this video, as well as just based on your feedback, I'm gonna start adding some timestamps, so I'll have timestamps below so that you can be able to kind of see the organization of this video, and if you're coming back to it and wanna go to a certain section, it'll be a little bit easier to find what you're looking for. To preface before getting into my top 3 deadlift variations, one thing I do want to say is probably of all 3 movements, I find myself programming less variation on deadlifts than any of the others. There's sometimes I'll program deficit deadlifts specifically for a conventional puller, not very often, if ever, for a sumo puller. Maybe sometimes block pulls, but I would say those are pretty rare. Like these 3 variations I'm going to talk about are really the 3 main ones, and I don't think I really go too far outside of that, as I think deadlift tends to be better as a comp specific lift, where squat and bench press tend to have a bit more carryover from variations and more variations that satisfy the specificity range, where with deadlift, if we get too far away from pulling from the floor or just the strength curve of a regular deadlift, I don't personally see much carryover from that. I've never been a big fan of bands, chains, some other things like that. I'm sure some other coaches have seen some benefit from that, but just at least in my system, it just hasn't worked out how I wanted when I've experimented with it. So I tend to be pretty simple on deadlifts. I stick to these 3 variations. And then finally, before getting into these variations, the one thing I want to throw out there is I want to give a special shout out to cluster singles. That was the one that I was kind of debating having in versus the eccentric deadlift to soft touch. but I eventually landed on the eccentric deadlift for the main reason that these are more based off of movement variations, not programming variations. And cluster singles is more of a programming variation. So I'm probably going to do an Instagram post on that to be able to cover that and give it its due credit. So make sure to look out for that in the coming weeks when I talk about cluster singles. But really what we're going to focus on here is my top 3 movement variations. And within that, kind of all the things that you need to know of how to do them correctly, how to program them, and how to get the most out of them. So without further ado, getting into the first variation, that's pause deadlift. And I think that's probably a very, very common one. I don't think anyone watching this video probably hasn't seen someone do a pause deadlift or done pause deadlifts themselves. This isn't a big shocker, but there's a good reason for it. And that's because pause deadlifts are just a very good variation for carryover to the comp deadlift, because it's not very different. It's just a comp deadlift where you have a slight pause in it. And so the specificity range and looking at kind of how it can transfer over, it's very close relation to the actual competition movement. So breaking down why I like pause deadlifts and what I think the benefits are of them, I think the primary one, and this kind of overrides a lot of the other ones I'm going to talk about, is it just creates more patience. I think a lot of people on deadlift have the issue of speeding up and being impatient in their setup. The fact of the matter is that the deadlift doesn't have an eccentric action, and that's why it's a deadlift. We're pulling from a dead stop, and that's the big difference between the deadlift and the squat and the bench press. And I think, and a lot of people will tend to try and speed up their setup and they're kind of wedge in to kind of like feel like they're getting an eccentric action. And while if you're really advanced and you're really good at doing that, maybe it has some benefit, but for most, it's just getting you out of position. So what pause deadlifts do is it really forces people to slow their setup and their wedge down. Because if you have nowhere to go because all you're doing is barely breaking the floor and pausing, you're not gonna rush into that because you know you don't have to just forcefully drive off the floor as much. It's more of a patient setup to get the right position because that pause is gonna punish you if you're out of position. And while this is definitely something I program for conventional pullers and definitely something I program for sumo pullers in the sense of patience, I think that probably applies a bit more to sumo pullers. Sumo, I've kind of mentioned this in other videos, sumo is more classical symphony and conventional is more rock and roll. You can get away with a little bit of a sloppy setup and a little bit of aggressive wedging and pulling on conventional a bit easier. With sumo, if you get out of position, it's gonna punish you a bit more. So it's more important to be patient and very intentional in that initial setup because that's gonna play big dividends throughout the entire movement. The next thing the pause deadlift does a really good job of is it helps to break the movement into leg drive to hip extension. You may have heard this described in the deadlift as it's less of a pull and almost more of a push sometimes. We're kind of thinking about leg pressing the floor away for that initial half of the movement, and then once the bar kind of gets to the knees or slightly past the knees, that's when we're driving more into hip extension. So when we're doing the pause deadlift, especially the variation that just off the floor, and really when I'm talking about all of this, I should have kind of put this out there in the beginning. I rarely program pause deadlifts just below the knee. I definitely do at times, but almost all, when I'm talking about this variation, I'm talking just off the floor. Just barely breaking as close as you can to the floor to make sure we are really hammering in that one, patience with the setup, but two, as I'm talking about here, is really thinking about leg drive to then hip extension, and doing the pause deadlift correctly really emphasizes that. And a pause deadlift is self-limiting. So just like any variation, there's a self-limiting aspect, but I'd say a little bit less than some other variations we're gonna talk about for sure, or even other variations for other lifts. Especially really efficient sumo pullers in particular, they sometimes really don't pause deadlift much less than they comp deadlift. And even for conventional pullers too, that's myself. Actually, one of my best sets ever was a pause deadlift. So when someone becomes very efficient in their starting position and technique, pause deadlifts tend to close their gap on the comp deadlift and isn't that self-limiting. So while I might program it slightly for self-limiting effects, it's not as much as some other variations either with deadlift or some other lifts. And as I already kind of mentioned, one of the benefits of pause deadlift is it's a very close relation to the actual competition deadlift. It's just a comp deadlift where you just pause for a second and then continue. It doesn't change anything with your setup. It doesn't change anything with the bar path or the height that you're pulling at or the position you start from or finish in. So it has good transfer because it's so close in relation to the comp deadlift that we're able to stay close to specificity year round while still able to use variations to accomplish other tasks. And with the pause deadlift, since for the most part, people are gonna slow down their setup and process, not only is it gonna help to improve position, but it's gonna help to increase our ability to implement other cues from my experience. It goes back to a lot of the other things I mentioned in the other videos with tempo or with pause squats or anything like that. If we slow down the movement, we tend to have a bit more time to process cues. So if someone's really struggling with some specific cue, especially maybe a setup cue or a positional cue off the floor that you're trying to work on, a pause deadlift can really help with that because it's gonna force you to slow down and be a little bit more aware of what you're trying to implement. And a possible cue you might be trying to implement is improving foot pressure awareness. And I think that's something pause deadlift does a really good job of, because you'll see some people on pause deadlifts, if they are biasing either too back onto their heel to start or too forward on their toes, you'll actually see as they pause, they'll start to shift because it won't be very comfortable. It's gonna punish you. It's gonna give you immediate negative feedback that something doesn't feel right to pause in that position because your weight bias is off. So it tends to give better foot pressure awareness. And while it's a little bit easier to understand foot pressure in the deadlift than the squat, all the things I talk about with squat foot pressure and mid-foot position very much apply to the deadlift as well. Like going back too far back on your heel, going too far on your toes, those are very much going to be in detriment to your deadlift strength, position, and technique, and your ability to kind of output force. So doing pause deadlifts can be a benefit to kind of help to improve your awareness of what your foot is doing and how you're biasing with foot pressure. One benefit that people a lot of times accredit to pause deadlifting is strength off the floor, and one can kind of see that because if it's improving your awareness off the floor and your position, you're likely to be stronger off the floor. But it's not like in the sense of like a direct transfer of like, oh, it's truly just increasing your strength. Probably not. It's probably improving position and awareness of position off the floor, and then that's improving your strength. Not so much of like this one-to-one transfer. Like if you already have good position, you're probably not going to improve your strength off the floor through pause deadlifts. In reality, what I'd actually argue, and if you watch my video on optimizing your setup for a strong lockout, is it's probably actually going to increase your lockout strength better, because lockout is usually dictated by starting position. I mean, if we're putting our pelvis and our glutes and hamstrings in a position where they're going to lock out too soon at the top, we're going to have a lockout issue. That's where it comes from. It's not from like some lockout strength. The lockout is actually where we should be the strongest. So usually that's a positional issue from the floor, and so pause deadlifts usually are what's going to help improve that, which they're then for are going to help your lockout strength. So I'd actually argue almost more that I don't really program these to help with strength off the floor. I program them for helping strength at lockout. And then lastly, one of the main benefits I see from pause deadlift is it helps to improve bracing. Since we have to pause, we have to have increased awareness of our bracing. And a common thing you'll see with pause deadlifts in people that are not bracing well is after the pause, they'll actually have a neutral back in the initial pull and then the pause, but then out of the pause, you'll see them start to round. And that's them losing their brace, because it's something a lot of people struggle with on squat and deadlift is they brace, they breathe in, they brace, but then as soon as they start moving, they just kind of forget about it. Like you have to actively hold that throughout the entire movement. So with the pause deadlift, if you don't actively continue to brace, you're gonna get punished. After that pause, you're gonna lose position. A lot of times you're gonna see that low back round under, you're gonna see the pelvis roll under a little bit. So that pause really forces someone to continue to maintain that brace, or else they're gonna get that negative feedback loop that's gonna kind of naturally kind of start to ingrain better patterns for them. So for how to perform the pause deadlift, it's fairly simple. It's just going to be your regular deadlift with a pause just off the floor. But I think some big things that I'll kind of make sure to kind of hit home here is one, pause as close to off the floor as possible. Even when people try and pause just off the floor, you see them end up coming up 4 or 5 inches and it being like a mid to high shin deadlift or pause. While those are still beneficial, I'm wanting most people to barely break the floor. And that's going to really kind of emphasize the need to building up tension, the need to not going from 0 to 100, but building up kind of like that 60% through kind of that wedging and slack pull, and then going from 60 to 100 into that kind of pause. And then as well as it's going to punish those who are trying to go too fast in their setup. It's really going to kind of force you to have to slow down and be intentional. So when we're looking at the pause deadlift, as mentioned, we're just going to be setting up like our normal deadlift. We're going to pull in position, we're going to barely break the floor, pause, and then finish the lift. And the cadence you're thinking there is legs, pause, legs, hips. And what that kind of means is I'm getting position, legs push to the floor, to leg press the floor away, I'm going to pause, I'm going back to the legs until the bar reaches about the knees, then it's hips coming through. So legs, pause, legs, hips. And if it's a pause deadlift, make sure it's actually paused. Don't just kind of break the floor, kind of stay there for a second and then come back up. Make sure it's a very solid pause, because especially if there's a self-limiting aspect you're trying to get from this, it's not going to be very self-limiting at all if you're not actually pausing. The only time I kind of like, okay, we can rush the pause a little bit, it's not a big deal, is if the intention is mainly just to slow down your setup. Like none of the other things I talked about are of worry, it's mainly to slow down your setup, because it will still accomplish that task. And I'll actually link an article I wrote about pause squats and deadlifts and kind of like when rushing the pause isn't the worst thing ever. And if the sole intention is to get someone to be more patient in their setup, and that's why you're programming with no other reason, kind of rushing that pause a little bit can not be too bad. But for the most part, make sure it's a solid 1 second pause. And then as I kind of mentioned, make sure we're not trying to pop into that pause. You'll see some people try and use that forceful wedge to kind of pop into that pause, and then it might work kind of, but I can guarantee you two things. One, you're probably going to lose your low back and your pelvic position. Two, it doesn't satisfy really any of the points I'm talking about. It's not satisfying the ability to be patient. It's not satisfying the ability to kind of make sure we are being our positional awareness off the floor. And I'll kind of talk about a little bit later about who should not do a pause deadlift. And kind of a hint. It's someone who uses the style of that pop. Looking at who needs pause deadlifts, I would say most lifters could benefit from them. Since they're so close in relation to the actual competition deadlift, they aren't going to really detract from the specificity too much. For the most part, they have very little cons and mainly just pros and benefits. So I would say almost universally, I program these at some point or another for almost every lifter I've ever coached. It just depends on how much. Some I'm going to program for it more often. It's going to be a staple in their programming. Some it's going to be more of kind of like a technique-based block where maybe they just need some reinforcement of some of these kind of this positional awareness and kind of this patience and wedging. But in some manner, most lifters can benefit from pause deadlifts. But being more specific and looking at some kind of specific examples of like when we would program pause deadlifts and who needs these, we'd be doing this for lifters who need to slow down their setup and be more intentional. So that's probably the single biggest reason, is someone who's being too fast with their initial setup. They're struggling with their initial setup, and we need to create more patience and slow down that process. Which then kind of builds into people who just need to improve their starting position. Maybe it's not even an issue that they're being too fast into their setup. They just in general need to improve their starting position, and a pause deadlift again just kind of helps to improve awareness of position in that manner to allow us to be able to transfer that better to our competition deadlift. And kind of looking at some of the more niche problems within the starting position, something a pause deadlift can help with is those people that tend to struggle with using their legs off the floor. They tend to try and back it off the floor from the beginning, and they think too much of a pull and not enough of the push to pull. And so the pause deadlift kind of helps someone to kind of get a better understanding of leg drive and how to implement that. And so if we're improving starting position, that would therefore help to improve lockout, as I mentioned. So if someone's struggling with their lockout position, which then would dictate lockout strength, pause deadlifts can be a good option to kind of help improve their ability to maintain position to that lockout, to make that lockout easy as it should be. And if you've got a lifter who's struggling with kind of a forward or back weight bias, or maybe where is the bar in relation to my stance, they're too far on their heels or too far on their feet, again, pause deadlifts just helps to get better awareness off the floor, which that's point number one. But point number two, also a reason to be able to implement pause deadlifts and who kind of needs this, is someone who is trying to implement other cues, but they're struggling to do that in their regular deadlift, and the pause deadlift can kind of slow that down. And then lastly, who needs this is someone who's struggling with their bracing. They're bracing, but they don't actually continue to maintain that brace throughout the movement. So the pause deadlift just gives that negative feedback, which then almost naturally the lifter starts to kind of change their bracing patterns to make sure that they start getting positive feedback from it. There are times with any variation though when you should not be using them. And with the pause deadlift, I say there's definitely less times when it's probably something we need to take out, but generally with most variations, probably the biggest example will be as we get closer to competition. If a lifter needs higher specificity, we probably need to draw back the variations. But with pause deadlift, well, there definitely is times that I'm going to draw that back, and we're going to focus just on the competition movement. There are definitely times and plenty of lifters that I'm going to run pause deadlifts all the way through until competition. I'll kind of break that down a little bit more of kind of the thoughts there when I talk about kind of how to program these. And then the second person I probably wouldn't program pause deadlifts for, and I've kind of touched on this, is someone who has kind of a pop style deadlift. And I definitely wouldn't recommend a pop style deadlift, like a Kaler Woolham-esque deadlift. That is a very advanced technique, and not everyone is going to be successful with that. You see some advanced lifters doing okay with that, but I definitely wouldn't recommend that for most lifters unless they've gotten to the point where they've really mastered that technique. And for that kind of lifter, a pause deadlift kind of might be a little bit detrimental because they're trying to basically explode so hard off the floor that if you try and slow that down, that's going to start changing that technique, because that would be, pause deadlifts would be something we do to get you away from the pop if that's a struggle, aka slowing down that setup. But if someone's a pop deadlifter and that is something that is vital to their technique to make them elite in the sense of Caleb Woolham, pause deadlifts probably aren't something I'm going to be programming for them. So lastly, with pause deadlifts, how and when to implement and program them. So this is pretty easy. I pretty much program them any way that I program a regular competition deadlift. I program them for super heavy singles, even up to a max sometimes if it warrants it. I program them for higher reps. I program for mid reps. Pretty much every way I program a competition deadlift, I'll also program a pause deadlift because, like I said, they're very close in proximity of specificity. Within that, depending on the reason, we might change the intent and when we program pause deadlift. So it's mainly for technique work. Maybe we're just keeping that on a secondary day as a way to kind of reinforce patterns for that main day. But if there's benefits we're seeing of how that's kind of relating to the transfer of strength to our competition deadlift, if we're trying to self-limit, if there's other things we're trying to do, there's very often that I'll be programming that on a primary day as well. But it could be, just like any movement, as we get closer to competition, we're probably gonna to make sure that primary day is our competition deadlift, but we very well may keep that pause deadlift on a secondary day. But for the most part, pause deadlifts can be programmed in any manner a regular deadlift can. Just as we get closer to competition, we're gonna have to manipulate that in some manner to increase specificity so that we're doing the comp deadlift that we're gonna do in competition mostly on our primary day. So next up is Romanian deadlifts or RDLs. And I already mentioned pause deadlifts are 1A, Romanian deadlifts are 1B. I consider these both fairly vital in the sense of the programming aspect, and for different reasons though. As I said, pause deadlifts are a bit more specific. RDLs are a bit less specific, but they definitely have some benefits that really transfer to our competition deadlifts. So I do want to give a shout out, because this is kind of something that can be semi-replaceable, is opposite stance deadlifts, mainly for sumo pullers. I don't typically, for a conventional puller, program sumo deadlift. I don't really think there's that much carryover, but for sumo, I definitely think there can be carryover from conventional in the sense of the kind of posterior chain dominance. And looking at the sumo deadlift in particular, the primary movers are very well driven in their strength and hypertrophy through the squat and the RDL. The conventional definitely can be a part of that too. It's definitely more posterior chain dominant, but I'm putting RDLs as the main one here because one, it's going to be a bit, it's going to have a better transfer between conventional and sumo for both styles. But even with sumo, the RDL is a bit more specific to attacking that posterior chain, where the conventional deadlift accumulates a little bit more fatigue. So while I may be doing some opposite stance stuff for sumo pullers, one thing I'll do is I'll link an article I wrote for powerliftingtechnique.com about doing the conventional deadlift for the sumo pull, so you can read through that at kind of timing. But the RDL, in my opinion, reigns supreme in the sense of being kind of an accessory variation to both the conventional deadlift and the sumo deadlift. So what are the main benefits of the Romanian deadlift? If there's one overriding one, this doesn't even have to do with anything strength-wise or hypertrophy-wise or anything, we need to know how to hinge. And honestly, it's unreal how many powerlifters have no idea how to do a hip hinge, when that is a foundational movement within the deadlift and the squat, primarily the deadlift, but in both, we have to hinge. We have to be able to allow our body to hinge at the hip without movement from our spine, without movement from our knee, just be able to hip hinge. So the RDL, at its most basic form, is a hip hinge. And so while I'll talk about it a little bit later, like if we're just truly working on the hip hinge, we can do some other accessory movements that are a little bit less demanding. But within the RDL, it's gonna be more specific because we're gonna be loading it heavier. It's gonna be closer to the competition movement in the sense of loading and the demands with the barbell. So it's gonna be a lot easier to transfer that hinge pattern from our RDL pattern to our competition pattern. And building off of that, the RDL is going to help to ingrain that pattern. So when we are coming back to our competition movement, that hinge is going to be more natural. And talking pause deadlifts, I talked about how it's kind of a thought process of a legs then hips cadence in the sense of the pull, leg drive to the floor, then hips at lockout. The RDL is simplifying that. It's simplifying that just to that kind of that hip portion. As I talk about a little bit later and kind of how to correctly do RDLs and kind of difference between RDLs and stiff leg deadlifts, because there is a difference. Is that the RDL is kind of more top down and it's just kind of the top 2/3 of the movement. We're taking out the leg drive, we're simplifying it to just the hips, and we're making sure we master the component of that top 2/3 of the movement of our deadlift. And RDLs in particular do a really good job of hypertrophy. I mean, there's a reason bodybuilders, it's a staple of bodybuilders. Bodybuilders don't really deadlift much. They don't conventional deadlift, they don't sumo deadlift, not very much. They very much do more RDLs because in the sense of just a true muscle builder, an RDL in my opinion is a bit better because it's a bit more targeted. The sumo deadlift and the conventional deadlift almost use too many muscles. It's not targeted enough for just general hypertrophy. So if we're looking at being as efficient as possible and targeting hypertrophy of certain muscles, there's other movements that target the quads much better. I mean, the deadlift really, even though it uses the quads and the adductors, it's not like the greatest builder of them. And then there's better muscles we can use to build the posterior chain in the sense of the hamstrings, glutes, and low back. Maybe more so the glutes and the hamstrings. The low back does a pretty good job, especially on the conventional deadlift. But the RDLs, in the sense of targeting hypertrophy, are going to be much more specific and accomplish that task better than our actual competition movement. And with teaching and ingraining patterns, one of the biggest reasons people struggle with keeping their low back neutral is an inability to hinge. While it could be low back strength, it typically is more a disproportionate kind of movement of the hips to your center of mass, and where we're displacing them and they're not the effective distance of our hips to kind of the center of mass and kind of where our lever arm doesn't allow our back to stay straight because it's going to have to manipulate its position to make sure to allow us to pull. That's something I cover in a couple other videos, so that didn't make sense. Make sure to watch those other deadlift videos to kind of have more of a breakdown on that. But the RDLs, if someone's really struggling with keeping a neutral low back, that's a big staple. Not only is it going to help to strengthen the low back, it's going to help to teach the pattern and the movement that's required to make sure we can find that neutrality throughout our regular movement and our competition movement as well. And then lastly with the RDL, it's a king, I would say, in the sense of self-limiting. It's a way to be able to get targeted stimulus to the primary movers of the deadlift, but in what I consider a much less fatiguing way. So in the sense of fatigue management, in the sense of self-limiting, RDLs are something I use a lot to be able to accomplish that task. I mean, I think I've had a lot of lifters, and I'll talk about this when we get to the programming, that we just find that they can't competition deadlift twice a week, but they need something of that similar pattern. Like if they don't have enough stimulus and kind of volume into the sense of the hinge, they don't tend to progress. So just deadlifting once a week doesn't go well. They need deadlifting and RDLs, or even in the sense of kind of looking at throughout the training cycle of the long-term yearly planning. There very well may be times where we're trying to lower fatigue on deadlifts to push squat, and we're gonna have to kind of implement RDLs on a secondary day to kind of accomplish that. So RDLs in the sense of self-limiting are a very good strategic variation to kind of accomplish that task. So before even touching the barbell, we need to know how to hinge. So what I want to do is give my quick rundown of how I'm going to teach the hinge to most people. So, I mean, when I worked as a personal trainer for about 7 years, worked with a lot of different general population clientele, and one of the first things we do is we learn how to hinge. If they don't know how to hinge, just body weight, we're going to get them there and then slowly progress that from like a body weight to a kettlebell to a barbell and whatnot, because just for general life, that's a foundational pattern, not just for powerlifting, but for life in general. We need to understand how to hinge, and it's going to help to kind of make our movement more efficient in kind of how we approach things. So with teaching the hinge, I'm going to simplify this. I'm going to give 3 main cues that I'm going to use, and this is going to be different for each person. Some people are better with kind of feeling cues in the sense of how they feel things. Some people do a bit better with directional and external cues. So it all just depends. Like all of these are going to kind of, some of these might actually lead to issues versus improving the hinge, where some of these are going to be amazing for someone. It's going to immediately click. So probably my favorite one, just to be able to teach someone how to hinge body weight, is in a simplified manner, a hinge is bringing your obliques closer to your thighs because it's closing the hips. It's creating this hip flexion. So if you put like your middle finger on the top of your thigh, your thumb on your oblique on both sides, and just pinch them, just pull them together, just pinch them together while maintaining center of gravity over your feet and not bending your knees, all of a sudden you magically hinge, and it's creating that position. I think within personal training, and a lot of times how I would approach this with general population, I think a lot of personal trainers do, is they teach you to reach your butt back towards a wall. And I would even put people near a wall sometimes so they wouldn't be scared of falling back and they actually kind of reach towards that. And that definitely is a good cue. There are some downfalls to that. The cue of pinching here is definitely better, but once we start loading that, we can actually keep kind of touching our thigh and our oblique. We're gonna have to do something different. So if we just maintain center of gravity, we keep our knee directly over our midfoot, or it says the tibia vertical, and we just reach our hips back We're good. And we can even do something too, just to kind of help make sure people can kind of maintain kind of counterbalance center of gravity. We can kind of reach our arms out to counterbalance that. Now, the one issue with that, Q, and I'll kind of talk about some incorrect ways to RDL, is people tend to then rock back and they get this negative shin angle. And again, this is part of teaching the hinge. Maybe that happens at first, but there's some other things that we kind of compound on that to kind of help bring it back. But we can definitely use the cue of just reaching the butt back towards the wall. And then the last one I'll use, and this one's a little bit more, I don't want to say complex, but a little bit harder, but some people this definitely works for, is just drawing your rib cage towards your hips. So if I brace, this is one of the big keys, we got to brace so we don't just tuck our rib cage under, is brace, and then take my rib cage and pull it right towards my hips. It'll never get there because obviously my rib cage can't meet my hips, but it's kind of just like the thigh to the oblique. It's kind of like how we can possibly use this within the actual movement, is we can think, draw our rib cage towards our hips. And even with the movement, even if we can't touch our thighs and our obliques, we can just think about, like, if we put a bar across here and we just try to pinch the bar with our hips, that's another way we can kind of process it as well. Because again, at its most simplest form, a hinge is just flexing the hips and in a sense closing that off, where in a sense my thighs and my obliques are touching. It can't go any further. Any more range of motion has to come from the knees or come from the back. So looking at how to stack cues and positional awareness on top of that, as I mentioned, one of the big issues people have is either reaching too far back into a negative shin angle, or even the opposite. This is where people really struggle. I mean, this is a big powerlifter thing. They end up turning the hinge into just another form of a squat. They have too much knee flexion in it. We're pretty much wanting to keep that tibia vertical. And one of the big easiest ways we can kind of make sure our awareness of our foot pressure is right is, a lot of times I'm going to have people start out with doing these barefoot. And I may have them always do RDLs barefoot, because if we're barefoot, we're not going to want to rock back under our heel. That's what it's going to keep us from. We might be a little bit more biased to rock towards our toes or let our knees bend, but we definitely aren't going to rock back to our heels. So we can kind of cue that hips back. And it's going to keep us accountable to not going too far back, because it's not going to feel good if we put all our pressure on that bony part of our heel. We should have some knee bend though. Like, we can't keep our legs completely straight. And I'm going to talk about that when we get to like the difference between an RDL and an SLDL. Neither of those should ever be truly stiff leg. That's not how you do an RDL or an SLDL. There should generally be about maybe like a 15 to 20 degree bend. For the most part, when I'm doing them, I kind of start like that. Like, I kind of start with that 20 degree bend. I just kind of feel very stacked, where I feel like my knee is driving down through my tibia into my foot. And then from there, I keep that same position as I hinge. I'm not increasing that knee bend, and I'm not changing really that amount of flexion that I have. So moving into the actual RDL with the barbell, a couple things I'll say is, one, as I get into the programming aspects, I'm usually programming these for higher reps. I don't really have much of a reason I would ever program these for lower reps and for just like maxing out. I don't really see a purpose there. So they're for higher reps, and they're for really targeting our posterior chain. If you can hold on to the bar with your grip, and it's not an issue at all, well, go for it. But I would say most people, I prefer to use straps on RDLs, because it kind of goes back to bodybuilding. I think powerlifting sometimes gets a bit too purist and forgets about bodybuilding. If we're wanting to target a muscle, it serves a good purpose to make sure other muscles aren't the limiting factor. That's why a lot of bodybuilders are always using straps for their rowing, for their RDLs and things like that, is they don't want grip to be the limiting factor. They want those primary movers of the hamstrings, glutes, and low back to be the limiting factors. So on RDLs, I'm typically having most people use straps for that reason. And in performing the RDL, I almost always program it with like a 2 to 3 second eccentric, usually like a 2 second eccentric, mainly because we're wanting to control. When you are doing an RDL, someone who's maybe never done them before, or someone who's not doing them right, you don't really feel the hamstrings, even though that's kind of like the main target, or the glutes. Like, you don't sit, like if you do a hamstring curl, oh, my hamstrings are pumped, they're on fire. If you do some hip thrusts or some glute kickbacks, oh, my glutes are on fire. You don't really feel that in RDL. You more feel a stretch. Most people who are doing them right, what they're going to say is they can just feel their hamstrings stretching, and they're like, for me at this point, they are fully stretched. And I'm going to get to kind of what happens if we go any further, but they're fully stretched, and I come back up. And I don't really like get this like sensation of a pump in my hamstrings. I just get this feeling of a stretch. And so to make sure we get the appropriate kind of context, and we maintain that tension on the appropriate muscles, I think it's very beneficial always to maintain about a 2 to 3 second eccentric, so that we're always on those targeted muscles, aka kind of bodybuilder style. Powerlifter style is lift the weight. Bodybuilder style is how can we make sure to put as much emphasis on the target, as much muscle as possible. So last thing before I actually show the RDL, because once I get to the RDL, it should be pretty simple at this point, because I've mentioned how to hinge, I mentioned kind of the things we stack on that for positional awareness and keep ourselves accountable, talked about kind of the programming, kind of what we're going to do to make sure we can target those muscles correctly. The last thing to really think about is what is an RDL versus a stiff leg deadlift, because they are different. An RDL, and some people kind of will debate the difference here. This is my opinion. I think some people, it's kind of a weird thing how stiff leg deadlifts have kind of different meanings. An RDL is top down and you never go all the way to the floor. And stiff leg deadlift is bottoms up, starting from the floor. So what I mean by that is an RDL, I wouldn't really care about this first initial movement. I'm just going to grab the bar to get to my starting position. If you want to, you can even pull it out of a rack. From there, an RDL is top down, controlling that eccentric, and coming back up. You can see there, I'm going to kind of touch on some things of an issue with an RDL here too, is I'm not going all the way down. And as I kind of mentioned, my goal is to fully and stretch my hamstrings and maximize my hip flexion, but not go past that. For me, as I'm hinging, right there, I've hit my end range. Like my stomach's hitting my thigh. I mean, maybe my hamstrings could stretch further, but at least, I mean, in the sense of like the room I have, I'm done. Like my hips are, or my torso is touching my thighs. I can't go any further. The only way I can go, and that's about mid-shin. That's for most people. I have pretty long arms, so if I have long arms, most people aren't going to be going all the way to the floor, but maybe some can. It just depends. You're just going to the point where hip flexion is maximized. At this point, I have two things I can do. I can bend my knees, and then literally now I'm getting into a deadlift position, which I talked about. We're doing the top two-thirds of the movement here of kind of like the hips aspect and taking out the leg drive per se. The other thing I can do, and this is where most people really get this wrong, is then they use their back. So they RDL, they look good, and then they reach to the floor, they let go of their back position and lose all of that kind of neutrality that we were trying to maintain. So a stiff leg deadlift is a little bit different. It's going to be a bit more back dominant. If I'm going to program these, RDL is probably more targeted to in the sense of posterior chain, in the hamstrings and the glutes, where an SLDL maybe is a bit more targeted to the low back. And maybe it's a bit more of a low back strengthener, whereas the RDL is a bit more of a hamstring glute strengthener and hypertrophy exercise. Now that's very broad generalization, but I'm trying to give some kind of direction there of the idea. Because a stiff leg deadlift is bottoms up. We're going to start from the floor. And maybe some people will kind of raise it a little bit because maybe they are trying to target the hamstrings, and this is a bit more comfortable way to do it. But in the sense of the SLDL and kind of how I see it performed, in the kind of true sense, we're going from the floor. And so to do that, I'm going to have to get a little bit more of my lower back involved and go a little bit past hip flexion to get there. And so I'm starting at the bottom, I'm coming up and controlling all the way down. So it's a bottoms up movement versus a top down movement. And so just for me, in the sense of kind of the benefits I described, I prefer RDLs to SLDLs. But in the grand scheme of things, they're not horribly different. I just think is that a lot of times we're programming RDLs as a self-limiting variation to manage fatigue, especially for the low back. Big key there on the low back. I have a lot of people that can't deadlift twice a week because their low back really gets fried from all the squatting and competition deadlifting, so we do RDLs instead. They're a little bit less fatiguing. SLDLs, I don't think they're that much less fatiguing. Literally, as I just did that there, I can feel my low back. I didn't feel my low back until I did that SLDL. So when you do the stiff leg deadlift, they're a bit more low back intensive, so we're not getting the same self-limiting or fatigue management aspect on the low back that we're getting from the RDL, which is, again, why I program the RDL in large part for a lot of people. So, kind of one of the last things here is a common fault with RDLs or stiff leg deadlifts or hinging in general. This probably comes more from the cue of hips back, kind of reaching your hips back towards the wall or whatever it may be. What that kind of sometimes entails is this anterior rotation and this lumbar extension, which kind of feels good and stable on an RDL because it's kind of biasing into the muscles we're moving. But we're not getting the full effect of what we're trying to do transfer. That's not what we do in our competition deadlift. We're wanting to maintain neutral, which is why I tend to more bias towards kind of the obliques to the thighs. And so as we're doing it, we can just kind of think about like, have context of where your hips are and just kind of, while maintaining that midfoot position, while maintaining your tibia vertical and your knee just kind of driving down through that tibia, just kind of bring those obliques to the thighs and come back up. And at that point, I had reached my full range of motion. So going into the RDL and really kind of showing it, I'm just gonna hit my starting position because it's top down. From there, I'm going to find my midfoot. I'm gonna have a little bend in my knee that I'm just gonna maintain throughout. I'm going to pull my obliques toward my thigh, stretch my hamstrings, there's my end range, and back up. And I'm pausing just for kind of dramatic effect of showing kind of where I'm stopping. I'll kind of show here, I'm only going about mid-shin, that's the biggest thing. We do need to go down far enough. Too many people kind of go, below the knee, and then come back up. That's not really accomplishing the task either. But we also want to make sure we're not going all the way down, because then we're turning the hip hinge into something a little bit else. Like I said, once we get down to the floor, most people are going to have to find added movement either through knee flexion or kind of letting that back give a little bit. So about that mid-shin position, when our obliques and our thighs touch, when our hamstrings are fully stretched, we return back up from there. So hopefully that helped to give you a better idea of how to hip hinge. Like I said, I thought about making a hip hinge only video, but per usual, Steve way, I'm gonna work it into an hour-long video somehow. But like I said, I'm gonna make sure to put a timestamp below. So if you wanna come back to this RDL portion in particular, it's gonna be a little bit easier to find. So who needs this variation? Who needs Romanian deadlifts? First and foremost, if you don't know how to hip hinge, this is the requirement. You have to do this. It doesn't mean you have to barbell RDL, but you need to hip hinge in some manner. And I'll kind of touch on that a little bit later of kind of ways we can make sure to be dumbbell RDLs, split stance RDLs, 45-degree hyperextensions, some other variations there, but we need to hinge. And especially if someone doesn't know how to hinge, maybe we have to regress and start from those easier variations, but we're going to progress to RDLs until we can load those and be strong at them, because it's just a requirement. Every beginner should have gone through that phase so that we reach the intermediate and advanced stage. That's just a foregone conclusion. The unfortunate truth is way too many people reach even an advanced stage and still don't know how to hip hinge, and that's just shouldn't be allowed. But even with that, if people know how to hinge, it's still very beneficial. So, I mean, Joe Stanek kind of talked about this in some variation programming, and I very much agree with this, is that in some manner, we're gonna have a hinge variation. So that very well could be barbell RDLs. I think it's a phenomenal variation. But even if we aren't doing barbell RDLs and we're comp deadlifting twice a week, we're doing comp deadlifts and a different variation of like a pause deadlift, or when I'm gonna talk about the tempo eccentric or anything else, probably there's gonna be some component of a hinge than an accessory movement. So I think it's fairly vital to maintain that pattern, because again, the squat and especially the deadlift are foundationally built on understanding how to hip hinge. So it's a movement pattern that we need to always be practiced in. But looking at more specific cases of kind of who needs Romanian deadlifts, one of the biggest times I use these outside of just the idea of building the posterior chain is people who get really beat up from competition deadlifting twice a week, either competition deadlifting or pause deadlifting, since it's so near in specificity. They struggle to deadlift twice a week. And so but they still need some type of hinge stimulus to kind of train those posterior chain muscles, because the squat kind of takes care of those kind of the adductors and the quads pretty well, but not as much the glutes and the hamstrings. I mean, it does, but not as much. So the RDL is a good supplement on a secondary day to be able to kind of get that hinge-based work, but not accumulate the same fatigue, especially in the low back, like I said, that then we can be more fresh, especially with the low back come our primary deadlift day. And then for sure, people who need to build up the posterior chain, the RDL is awesome. I'm going to argue that it's probably even better to do than the regular competition deadlift, because it's more targeted to those exact muscles. And learning from bodybuilders, they don't usually conventional deadlift, they definitely usually don't sumo deadlift. They use RDLs because they are a much better posterior chain builder in the sense of hypertrophy, because of the targeted approach to those muscles than doing the regular deadlift itself. And then people who struggle technique-wise, the RDL can really help, especially with people who struggle with their initial setup. I think like the initial setup, as I mentioned in some of my other videos, really dictates the rest of the deadlift. If we get that right, it's just kind of this loaded spring that we didn't just go straight up. Like there's not much else to it. Like the actual lift becomes pretty simple. There's so many people that in their initial setup don't have any hinge aspect. They just kind of go to reach and grab the bar, they squat down to the bar, they don't hinge, and the hinge has to be part of that initial setup. So we load that hinge process, so it's kind of this loaded tension and spring as we go into that concentric phase. And I think people who really struggle with like low back rounding, an RDL is one of the first things we're gonna go to kind of help with that. Not only one, to teach the hinge, which is probably the main issue, is some type of movement discrepancy of not hinging correctly, and then changing that lever arm and kind of that fulcrum, and the hips and the shoulders kind of have to come together, aka creating rounding. But it also just helps to strengthen the low back. And that might be something too, like I said, SLDL versus RDL. Maybe if we truly need low back strengthening, and SLDL might be a good option there. But in the grand scheme, an RDL still fits that criteria, and it's going to help someone be able to not only strengthen that position of the hinge in the low back, but also be able to ingrain that kind of pattern to then transfer to the regular deadlift to hopefully maintain that better neutrality. And then the last one, this is a bit more specific to specific training blocks and specific people, but some people, if they're really trying to push their squat, their deadlift fatigue carries over too much. And so maybe it's a time to be able to kind of put in RDLs to be able to kind of eliminate some of that low back fatigue so that they can really kind of focus on their squat and push that in the time being. But that, like I said, that's more specific on some type of specific block and focus within that. And then on the opposite side, who shouldn't use this variation? And compared to pause deadlifts, even though I'm saying 1A to 1B, there definitely is more of a downside to RDLs in their specific usage because they have a lower specificity rating. So while there's extreme benefits, in my opinion, to doing RDLs, there's definitely some cons and sometimes we shouldn't use it. And one of them is if you need a competition deadlift or some close variant like a pause deadlift twice a week to maximize your strength, as you get closer to competition, you probably need to pull RDLs out because they're not highly specific. So much like a lot of variations, you need to pull that out closer to competition. RDLs is definitely one that's probably going to be used a little bit further away from competition if someone needs to deadlift twice a week. And it doesn't even have to be close to competition, but I mean, if strength is the goal within a training block, and again, deadlifting twice a week, or maybe even 3 times a week. I've never programmed 3 times a week per se. But if someone needs to comp deadlift twice a week for maximizing strength, in that kind of block, we're probably going to pull RDLs out a little bit, but I'll even describe with that. Maybe there's times we even leave that in a little bit, but we do it in a different manner, and I'll describe that kind of when we're talking about the programming aspect of it. And the last one is people with low back issues. And I don't want to like frame RDLs as it's gonna hurt your low back. And this is just an experiential thing from people I have that have had some low back issues. Sometimes RDLs kind of bug it a little bit. I mean, some people very much switch to a sumo deadlift for the reason that conventional deadlift causes too many back flare-ups. And if that's the case, RDLs is probably gonna do it as well. And so what I'm gonna say there is maybe barbell RDLs aren't the best choice, but we still need to hinge. Like that's still a primary component. That's where we kind of regress and use more accessory variations of like a dumbbell RDL, a split stance RDL, or a 45-degree hyperextension, which is a little bit less demanding on the low back, but still trains that hinge and that pattern. And that can be something we can use for them. So I don't want to lump the RDL as bad for your back at all. Like literally, if someone has back issues, when I used to train, especially general population with back issues, that's one of the main things we need to do to strengthen their back, like, and fix it, is they needed to learn how to hinge. But I've just had, this is just because of experience, and I want to point this out, is some people just never tends to feel great, tends to be a little bit too demanding on their low back, so therefore we just use other like less aggressive variations and accessories to kind of be able to target that hinge component instead. So to cap off RDLs, let's take a look at how to program them. So for RDLs, and let's lump SLDLs in there as well, because they'd be similar, but like I said, I very much tend to bias towards Romanian deadlifts instead. I'm gonna program these much more like an accessory movement. Like an accessory you wouldn't program, you typically in like the 1 to 5 rep range. So I'd say the vast majority of the time I'm programming RDLs in the sense of the barbell in the 6 to 10 rep range. And even if it's an accessory, probably in the 6 to 10 rep range as well. Unless we're doing like 45-degree hypers, and I might go to 12. But RDLs, 6 to 10 reps, maybe occasionally going to 5 if I'm seeing some type of strength transfer, like someone getting stronger RDL seems to very much benefit their regular deadlift. Maybe to 5, definitely not lower than that. Because again, for going back to the baseline of RDLs, they're a very good posterior chain builder, being more targeted to the glutes, hamstrings, and low back. So I'm gonna be more biasing towards higher rep ranges for the hypertrophy benefits. And even within that, we're still going to get the benefits of strengthening as well in those muscles. I also really never program these as a primary day movement. They're always a secondary day movement, except, and I kind of already mentioned this, if possible, like even using these all the way into competition, even if someone deadlifts twice a day, maybe they're kind of the secondary movement on a primary day to the competition deadlift. But the one caveat there, and this is just my own personal preference, if I'm doing barbell RDLs, not like an accessory would be different, but let's say on a primary day, we do 5 total sets in general. And if you've watched my other videos, I tend to calculate total workload or volume by set count. So let's say we do 5 total sets on our primary day, and we want to do some RDLs. If we do 5 total sets, maybe that means we do 3 sets of our competition deadlift and 2 sets of RDLs. If I'm doing barbell RDLs, I think they are loaded and fatiguing enough, even though they're self-limiting and less fatiguing, it is enough that I'm going to count that as a deadlift set. Now, if I'm doing like dumbbell RDLs or split stance or hyperextensions, that's separate. Like maybe I'm gonna do 3 to 4 sets of that, but I'm also gonna do 5 sets of competition deadlift. But just maybe this is some type of fatigue management. Maybe I need to keep RDLs in. I don't know. I'm not saying this is super common, but in the case that maybe I do place it on a primary day, or maybe I keep it on a secondary day, even closer to a meet, if I'm keeping that in for maybe 1 to 2 sets for some type of movement basis or training basis or even volume basis, maybe it's just to be able to get higher rep work in closer to competition so we don't detrain the posterior chain too much. I might put that secondary to the main movement of the day, but it's going to also count towards that total set count for deadlifting. And then the last thing I'll kind of say for RDLs is I've seen some people kind of argue that they more have benefit for conventional pullers because they're a bit closer in specificity, which I agree. A conventional, as I kind of showed, we're doing the top 2/3 of the conventional deadlift. And if I want to go to the floor, I would just bend my knees a little bit and then boom, I'm in my conventional deadlift pattern, which goes back to how we can ingrain this pattern and how it can transfer. But some people say, for sumo, it's not as good. I don't fully agree. Again, it goes back to the basis of what we're trying to train there. The RDL is not the same as like a pause deadlift in the sense of kind of how we're programming it. It's much more in the sense of self-limiting and being more focused in the targeting of certain muscles. And as I kind of alluded to before, I'd almost argue it's a great accessory for sumo deadlifts for the fact that the squats and other leg accessories tend to build the quads and the adductors really well. And then the RDLs tend to build the glutes and the hamstrings really well, which combining those two, if we're looking at the kind of hypertrophy of that, is exactly what we need to be strong for a sumo deadlift. So it is definitely an accessory I use for sumo. It's definitely an accessory I use for conventional. I don't think either or I use it less, but I will say I definitely find more often, I've kind of alluded to the people that tend to get too fatigued from comp deadlift twice a week. That seems to be more often sumo or conventional pullers than sumo pullers, and that goes to low back fatigue. Conventional is just a little bit more fatiguing on the low back since there's a bit more of a hinge component and hip flexion. So I definitely find a good deal of conventional deadlifters seem to not be able to deadlift twice a week and continue to maintain strength. They get too beat up from that. So I definitely have seen more often that I have conventional being programmed on a primary day and RDL being programmed on a secondary day for a conventional deadlifter long term and even leading into a meet, where I've had that on sumo, but definitely not as often. So that's the one caveat I'm going to put there, but that goes into more the fatigue management side of things versus the actual training effect. Definitely, I think benefits both sumo and conventional pullers. So that leads us to our final variation, and that is tempo eccentric to soft touch deadlifts. And that's probably the one that's maybe a little bit more of a surprise. Like pause deadlifts and RDLs are kind of like, duh, like everyone does those. That probably wasn't much of a surprise. But tempo eccentric to soft touch is probably the one that a lot of you haven't done. And in my opinion, that is the single best variation to help someone technique-wise with their initial bar position and hip height position. So you might search for videos like, where's our starting hip height? Where should we put the bar? A tempo eccentric to soft touch deadlift answers that question for you. And when I get into kind of breaking down and showing how to do it, you'll see why. But what it's going to do is it's just, you're naturally going to get in the exact position you should be starting during that eccentric portion. So technique-wise, this is a big technique-based movement. I wouldn't really call this a strength-based movement. I very much am programming this solely for technique. And so moving on with the benefits, as if it's helping to establish the bar position and hip height, it's establishing your starting position. So you're gonna get to feel what it's like. And so when I say soft touch, as I kind of break down the movement, we're actually gonna kind of pause in this soft touch position for a second, where you're actually in your starting position, slack fully pulled out, weight on the floor, but kind of hovering at the same time where all the weight's not completely just resting down and you're losing tension. So you're feeling that starting position. And then that feeling should be able to be more translatable into your actual position of knowing, okay, well, that feels different. My hips are too low, my hips are too high, the bar's too far in front of me, because you know what it should feel like because of this variation. And this is a very self-limiting variation, very self-limiting. I'd say people can only do maybe 80 to 85% of their normal deadlift on this variation because it's very taxing. Like as we get to kind of the tempo, I usually do like a 3 to 5 second tempo. People hate these. They are very difficult because of how long and the time under tension and being a deadlift and being very demanding. So they're very self-limiting. So in the sense of programming these on a secondary day, they work great in the sense of just like an RDL of like if someone's getting really beat up from competition deadlifting twice a week, but they need something in the sense of whether it's building posterior chain with an RDL, or maybe they need this to be more technique based for skill practice because they need skill practice twice a week, but they can only handle deadlifting truly once a week. This can be a great variation to kind of implement in there for the self-limiting aspect. It also helps to reinforce the hinge to pattern to leg drive in the sense of as we go through the eccentric, I'll show some common faults, is some people, their cadence going back down is not the cadence coming up. If it's leg drive to hip extension, going down, it should be hip extension to leg drive. And some people would get kind of backwards on that. So if we can get better at the eccentric loading per se and the descent, it tends to also help kind of our pattern coming up as well. And then lastly, it helps with bracing. If you're doing a 3 to 5 second eccentric on a deadlift, if you're not bracing going down, it doesn't feel good. So it's just gonna force you to brace it. You're gonna have to. So it's just kind of an inadvertent thing that it helps to create, and the benefit of that to then hopefully then again translate that to your regular deadlift of understanding how to maintain that brace throughout versus just breathing in and then letting go as soon as you start to actually do the lift. All right, so looking at how to do these correctly, the initial setup is just a regular deadlift. It's only the eccentric and the following reps that are gonna change a little bit. So we're gonna get into our deadlift. First rep is normal, we're up, and then as we're going down, 5 second eccentric. And then as we get to the bottom, soft touch, come back up. 3 to 5 second eccentric going down, real good control, soft touch, come back up. And then make sure even that last rep, let's say we're doing 3 reps, we go all the way down, soft touch, release. You can hear me let that slack out. The big thing there is not only one, very slow eccentric, but the soft touch. And how I cue that is if you had a baby sleeping next to you and you did not want to wake that baby up, you're trying to touch that floor so lightly that you wouldn't wake the baby up. It would be so quiet that it wouldn't really make very much noise. And you kind of heard that, even though I don't have a lot of weight, I was letting it slam on the ground. I was just very lightly touching and then pausing there. I wasn't letting slack out. I wasn't letting tension out. I was just very lightly touching, holding there for a second, and then coming back up. And that goes back to you understanding exactly what your starting position is. Because if we're loading that eccentric, we're gonna end up right where we should start. What you'll find with these is someone will never have hip rise, they're never gonna have weird bar sway if they're doing it right, because it's gonna put them in their perfect starting position. The bar is gonna be directly over their midfoot, their hips are gonna be at the perfect height, everything is loaded correctly, their shoulders are over the bar, because we're loading that eccentric into position, and if we load the eccentric incorrectly, it's not gonna be very comfortable for us. So the two things that kind of go along with that, of kind of do's and don'ts, is one, I probably use straps with these, especially with hook grip pullers. This would be absolutely miserable. And kind of going back to RDLs, the goal isn't necessarily to it could be to help with grip strength a little bit, maybe, but if we really don't need grip strength, it's going to be a lot easier to make sure we are just maintaining control of the bar and technique, and not worrying about our hands tearing open from doing a 1 minute set of a 5 rep soft touch or eccentric to soft touch deadlift. So I definitely have a lot of people use straps on these just so that their hands aren't the limiting factor and they can worry about more of the technique. The second thing, making sure we're loading the eccentric correctly. So what I mean by that is a common thing I see with these is someone, when they start the descent, they bend the knees and then they start hinging, and now the bar is way out in front of me. Because if the knees get in the way, it's gonna push the bar around. That goes back to someone who maybe doesn't even know how to hinge correctly in the first place, and we need to be doing RDLs as well. But we need to make sure we're doing the opposite of the concentric. If the concentric is legs, 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 hips, the eccentric is mainly hips, hips, hips. Then once the bar passes the knees, then we're getting into flexion. It's the same thing with sumo too. Even though it's a little bit different of a pattern, it's still legs and then hips, and then it's hips, and then legs. So we've got to make sure we reverse that cadence, or else we're not going to be able to get the full benefit of the movement because the bar is not going to end up in the right position. So now that we've kind of broken down how to do a tempo eccentric to soft touch deadlift, especially if a lot of you have never even seen those before, let's kind of get into who needs this. And as I've already mentioned, this is mainly a technique-based movement and a self-limiting fatigue management-based movement. So a lot of these kind of who needs this is going to be breaking down into those aspects. So in kind of a big summary of who needs this, someone who needs to improve their starting position. And that kind of breaks down into a couple other things. Is one, someone who maybe sinks their hips too low, because this is going to give a better kind of idea of kind of what your starting hip height should be. Or someone who maybe is starting with the bar off center of their midfoot. Maybe you're starting the bar a little bit too forward, a little bit too far back in your stance. This is going to give a good idea of kind of where it should start. And what I could say, like if sometimes it's hard as an athlete to know that, take a direct side view of your normal deadlift, and then take a direct side view of this soft touch eccentric, and look to see where is that bar in relation to your foot, and see if there's a difference in kind of how that's setting up. And that's going to give you a good idea if your bar position is different in your regular deadlift than to where an eccentrically loaded deadlift places it, which usually is going to be the optimal placement. And with that, this is a good movement for people who don't respond to other cueing. Some people just don't do good with cues. They don't internalize them well, they don't have good body awareness, they just kind of have to be forced in the position. So if that's someone you're dealing with, like they're just not responding to cues, do a tempo eccentric to soft touch deadlift, and it's just gonna put them in the position. And then they're gonna start to learn what that feels like on their own versus having to use these cues from a coach that they have to then kind of internalize and implement. And then to an extent, an RDL accomplishes this better, but this can also help people who struggle with hinging. Because like I said, a lot of people who struggle with hinging on this movement will kind of start to bend their knees first and then hinge, which is incorrect. You need to hinge first and then bend the knees in sense to do the opposite cadence of the concentric. So if someone's struggling with hinging, this can kind of help to kind of solidify that pattern a bit, but that's definitely a big secondary benefit compared to an RDL would better suit that. And then lastly, who needs this? Someone who's really struggling with fatigue by comp deadlifting twice a week, but they really need the skill practice. Like doing RDLs on a secondary day, they don't feel skilled enough and practiced enough, and they feel stale each day coming back to their main day. So this is a good way to be able to really limit loading and limit fatigue from deadlifting on a secondary day, but still have the skill practice that they can then translate onto their primary day. And with tempo eccentric soft touch deadlifts, there's definitely times not to do this and people who don't need it. Like this is a more specialty variation that I use compared to RDLs or pause deadlifts, which are more universally applicable. So just like any variation, if you watch the videos, it's been pretty much the first point every time. As we get closer to competition, it's probably something you're gonna pull out. This is very technique based. The only reason you leave it leading in the competition would be mainly for the fact of trying to manage fatigue a bit better, but I'd say for the most part, most people I'm going to pull this out, and even if we need to manage fatigue, we're just going to do lighter regular deadlifts on that secondary day versus continuing to do these tempo eccentric to soft touch. Another time, or someone who doesn't need this, that it wouldn't be the best time to program, is during a hypertrophy phase. Like if your main goal is hypertrophy, this isn't the best variation for you. We're reducing loading, it's going to be very low reps. This doesn't really fit the goal. Now, if it was a hypertrophy and technique style block and you're wanting to accomplish both tasks, maybe there's some benefit there, but this is definitely more of a technique-based movement. And then lastly, who doesn't need this? If you're already really solid on your starting position, your hip height, your bar placement, maybe you don't need this. This, like I said, this is more like a pause deadlift is a little bit better. Like someone who has a good deadlift and nothing really needs to change, a pause deadlift is a bit better at reinforcing those, where a tempo eccentric soft touch is a bit better at teaching them in the first place. So that's a good kind of idea, kind of how I separate those two. While pause deadlift can teach those, the tempo eccentric, the soft touch is a better way to kind of teach it in the first place, where a pause deadlift can help kind of maintain those patterns and make sure we don't regress back. To wrap up tempo eccentric to soft touch deadlifts, let's talk about how we'll program them. Almost always, I don't think I've ever not done this, it's going to be on a secondary day. This is never a primary day, because again, this really isn't strength based. So it's almost always on a secondary day because it's going to be lighter and technique based. As well as I pretty much stick between 2 to 5 reps. I don't go more than 5 because I'd probably get fired as a coach. But in seriousness, you're just going to start breaking down in form. The time under tension and the control is going to break down. So when we're talking about technique, if the reps aren't going to be efficient and be good and be solid on every single rep, there's no point to it. So 6 plus tends to start breaking down, so there's not much point in that. And then just 1 rep doesn't really have as much of a point because we aren't doing a a soft touch to reverse back to concentric. So we want to at least do 2 reps, so we at least have a rep where we are reversing from that soft touch back into the concentric to kind of feel what that starting position should be. As I've already mentioned, I program these with a 3 to 5 second eccentric. I don't really do less than that. Like, there wouldn't be a point to speed up the descent. The whole point is to really slow this down. So 3 to 5 seconds seems to be kind of the hot spot based on kind of each individual. I typically program 5 seconds because just the fact of the matter is 5 seconds usually turns into 3 seconds. So usually I'll program 5 as a coach, knowing that a lot of times the athlete's just going to end up doing 3 seconds because just fact is these are pretty miserable. These are hard. So people tend to speed them up a little bit. And then lastly, I'm going to program these during times of technique improvement. As I already mentioned, if the main goal is hypertrophy, probably not the best block. If the main goal is strength, maybe if you're using it for fatigue management. Otherwise, this is very much a technique-based movement where RDLs and pause deadlifts in some manner could be in a program the entirety of someone's training. The soft touch to eccentric to soft touch deadlift, they're going to find their way in and out a bit more. They're not something that I'm probably going to keep in long-term, barring someone really needs these for the fatigue management aspect to maintain skill practice. So that is my top 3 favorite variations for deadlift: pause deadlifts, RDLs, and tempo eccentric to soft touch. So that also wraps up my series on top 3 variations for each lift. I really wanted to cover all of these, not only to give my ideas of top 3 variations, but really each of these variations could have been their own video. But per my style, I like to do these longer form content videos, put these all together so that you can be able to kind of have an encyclopedia of how to do these variations appropriately. So if you liked it, if you like this whole series, make sure to subscribe, like, comment, give me any feedback you have. If you made it this far, I'll give you a little bit of kind of a spoiler alert. Next series is something I've been building to for a while. I've done all these programming series on volume, intensity, intermediate to advanced, RPE, a lot of different programming stuff. I want to wrap that up into me actually writing a program like in real time, as well as this is going to be a free program to be released. The free program is on my website right now if any of you are running it. I wrote it probably 2-ish years ago. Still a good program, but definitely some things I changed from that. So I'm going to be putting out a new 15-week intermediate program, and that's what I'll be writing in live real time. We'll see, that might be a couple videos that I kind of break up. I might do each block as an individual video. But I'm going to write it and explain everything I do in writing it, so that you can really kind of see how to take all the principles and thoughts and theories that I've kind of discussed in the other programming videos and how that plays out into actual writing a training block and a mesocycle in sense of these 15 weeks that would lead into competition. So that's all I've got for today. So I will talk to you all later.